Rise from your grave.
One of the most iconic Sega arcade games of all time. This is Alter the Beast, which was originally released in August of 1988. It is ridiculous to assume, if you have searched for this video, that you wouldn't know what Alter Beast is about. But very briefly, the game is set in ancient Greece, and you have been chosen by Zeus to rescue his daughter Athena from the underworld. The game is a fairly short one compared with others and features just 5 stages. The aim is to collect 3 orbs, which in turn transforms the player into a beast, a different one for each stage. Then finally a boss awaits you once you collected all 3 of these per stage. The game is loved by many and was a big success for Sega back in 1988 and quickly became a product of pop culture and remains in contemporary pop culture today. As always, massive and successful arcade games became riddled with a plethora of home computer and console ports of the time. I apologise if there is missing ports as always, but we'll look at the main systems nevertheless. Of course, sequels or reboots will not be added in this video. Here we go.
Welcome.
Despite looking very good with an undeniably great sounding soundtrack along with sound effects, the Amstrad CPC version of this game takes slow to a whole new level entirely, to the point in fact where there is no point in playing this version at all. It is very clear that Activision were taking a bit more than they could chew with this conversion. Either that or just like many arcade conversions, this was a product of being rushed out too early. Scrolling is horrendous, gameplay is horrendous. In fact, let's just forget this whenever it existed and move on. Quite possibly one of the ugliest games for the Commodore 64. Released in 1989 by Activision, it features no music, sound effects which are pretty much mediocre. Gameplay is horrendously slow pace, which makes collecting power-ups to transform very time consuming, especially if the enemy holding one runs away from you. Severely over pixelated and yeah, just an absolute bore to play. No introduction. My brother bought this for the C64 back in the day. He rarely played it, neither did I. It obviously didn't make much of an impression. At times, hitting zombies seemed to take an eternity to defeat too. Most normally die after 2 to 3 hits. Every now and again I found myself hitting for around 20 times. No exploded limbs for the C64 conversion either, just a real dull, totally forgettable port from Activision here. Now, if you have never seen a ZX Spectrum game before, don't let this conversion put you off. This big heap of colourful mess is known as Color Clash, where characters adopt the colours displayed behind them. The Specky is known for this, and in the past 10 years or so, I have absolutely loved the Spectrum, so much so that I managed to grab a Spectrum by Retro Games Limited before they sold out this year, and for Christmas I'll be building a brand new Specky from scratch using different new parts. Anyways, why I have ranked this colourful mess over the C64? Easy. Though this can be a little wearing on the eye, behind this is a fairly fast scoring game, complete with combined music and sound effects. Yes, absolutely far from amazing by any means, and there is no transformation scene when collecting the 3 orbs, but that was a territorial risk of being a microcomputer user back in the day. This version was brought to you again by Activision in 1989. You will see similarities with the ZX Spectrum port, which I've just covered, with this MSX conversion. Although the MSX version is much more pleasing on the eye by far, the music is also very nice in this version too. It just reeks of 8-bit computer chiptunes, totally nostalgic sounding. Gameplay is fairly smooth and kind of on par with the Spectrum version. The reason I've ranked this version above the Spectrum is simply because it isn't like being on an acid trip whilst playing. Collision detection is pretty solid with this version too. Not a bad version if this is type of Star Wars retro that you like. Imagine that if Micro Machines went Ultra Beast all of a sudden. This Japanese version is what you'd likely end up with. As you can see, sprites are tiny and very uninspired gameplay with this Famicom version too. I did notice that if you don't crouch next to a zombie and punch, they will repeatedly punch you, and they seriously don't give up trying to punch you. Controller wise, this is actually pretty responsive, and it does play pretty well too. It is just a very bizarre version of Ultra Beast. Enemies do not explode in body parts in this version, which is understandable. In the early days, Nintendo didn't want to associate itself with violent or overly gory games. Music in this is pretty average for a Famicom game. A very strange choice of colour palette to use in this version. I wouldn't say this was an awfully bad port as such, it is just very different from other conversions. I suppose Nintendo back then were still focusing on predominantly cutesy sprites and characters with little emphasis on more detailed stuff. It's a known fact that Ultra Beast isn't the fastest scrolling game ever made, but it was purposely designed this way, and most ports followed this formula. Some in fact go even slower. The IBM PC compatible conversion is kind of like Ultra Beast on speed. This is the best visuals the DOS version had, and to be fair, it doesn't look that bad visually. A combination of the beeper music and sound effects, which constantly overpowers the music, is enough to drive a man insane after a minute, that is. Collision detection appears to be pretty good with this port. I did notice, however, that a couple of animals did randomly bump into me from time to time, but did not deplete any energy from me. But that is kind of part and parcel of old school games that weren't frequently updated online like we get today. For those who prefer a faster version of Ultra Beast but can tolerate beeping, then this port is definitely for you. The Commodore Amiga's conversion, released in 1989 by Activision 2, is a very infuriating play. Teams of zombies, creatures, and hawks will come at you all in one go and leave you fighting for dear life in a corner somewhere. The scrolling pace of this version is acceptable, and it even has a nice opening similar to the original arcade game. No music, just sound effects, which are average for this style game. Visually, I have seen so much better on the Amiga. This is a little on the pixelated side. It is also a version that has gone much darker in contrast compared with most other ports. Collision detection appears to be satisfactory with this port. I actually did not have the patience to go through the full stage because the difficulty level was just ridiculously hard with the Amiga port of this. Really, this conversion is very punishing. It just takes away that whole fun aspect of playing it in the first place. It's not too often that I rank an Atari ST game over an Amiga game, but here we are. This was likely the best home conversion of Ultra Beast we got. Why? Firstly, although at times the sound effects drowns out the music, the gameplay is fairly smooth and controllers and collision detection are pretty spot on here. Again, much like the Amiga port, the ST version also has a darker tone, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It looks quite nice. I was fairly impressed with this version. The coders working on this for Activision obviously worked at a faster pace during its development in order to have a half decent version compared to the other micro ports. Like I say, if there is a micro version you were wanting to play, I think this is likely the best of the bunch. The Sega Master System version is actually mediocre. The main letdown of this is the frame rate. Oddly enough, I had to put up with this version on my Sega Master System back in the day. I asked my mum to buy me Shinobi, but actually came back with this one. I wasn't impressed at the time. Now, many of you watching this might not be aware, but Sega Master System had a sound expansion module, but were more known for this in Japan. This unit was known as an FM sound unit. It had around 50 odds compatible FM games, and Alter Beast was one of them. Okay, so apart from the poor frame rates, characters on screen almost move as bad as the Master System's port of Golden Axe, which can be a little frustrating at times. Visually, I think this is clearly over-pixelated, and needless to say, I wasn't a massive fan of this when I was little either. Even with the enhanced sound enabled, I just don't think it is enough to make this any higher up on my list. I had high expectations for the PC Engine CD conversion of Alter Beast, but wasn't overly impressed. Sure, it plays well and looks average for a CD game. The issue that this version suffers is every now and again the game will pause for a second or two, like it's loading more data from the CD. This can get a little frustrating whilst battling out a horde of the undead. I was also expecting some kind of remaster of the music, or at least enhanced sounds, but it just didn't seem to do much. Just seemed like a complete missed opportunity for the developers. Real shame with the PC Engine CD version of this. Virtually the same as the PC Engine CD edition, minus the issue with pausing and skipping. The PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16 port of Alter Beast, plays really well, and for an 8-bit console certainly makes the NES port look pointless. The opening of stage 1 is nicely animated with your character coming into the game with the smoke surrounding him. It sounds much like an upgraded 8-bit game compared with other mainstream systems such as the NES and the Master System. It also handles well and seems very easy to hit zombies down too. This port also included zombies exploding where bits of body parts would fly everywhere, which is always a bonus for Alter Beast. Let's not forget, that's just how we should have it. After all, several ports don't include that, and I think this just adds that more to the game. The gameplay handles smooth and screen scrolling moves nicely too with no lag as such.
Power up.
You all knew that this one was heading to the top spot, but you have seen some versions of this classic in this video in the process which you have likely never seen before. This game was actually the first time I ever played on a Sega Mega Drive. In my local toy shop around 1992, they had a Mega Drive Mark I kiosk, and this game was on demonstration. It majorly impressed me at the time, and that really wasn't just young eyes. The truth is, Alter Beast on the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, which released back in 1990, literally was an arcade perfect version for the living room. Compared to with everything in this video, this version, aside from the arcade game, is enjoyable to play. No frustration with slower scrolling screens or zombies that refuses to die. This truly was a staple in the Sega Mega Drive's library, and most had this game when I was a kid. So that's it for today's Alter Beast ports. Let me know in the comments what you think should have been ranked higher, or do you agree with the Mega Drive taking first place in this? Is there actually a arcade game which had many ports that you want to see a video for? Let us know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.
Welcome to your doom.
Fight!
If Doom was the goriest and most controversial for computers, then Mortal Kombat was the goriest and most controversial for arcades and a good few home computer, console and portable conversions. The world was greeted with Street Fighter II a few months before Mortal Kombat was unleashed by Midway and Taito in 1992. As I said in my Street Fighter II ports video, it seems back then like you were either into Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter. Personally, I chose Street Fighter, but it's undeniable how superior Mortal Kombat looked at the time in terms of realism through its digitized presentation. The added bonus was some sickening and disturbing death moves, which caused outrage with some politicians and parents at the time. These could not seem to understand that these were just games. Let's be honest, a kid who wanted to shoot ice out of his or her hands and thought this was possible should have had some kind of help in the first place. Likely, Mortal Kombat was a scapegoat to blame many issues onto a single subject, so it's nicely justified. Just like every other arcades game, we've got several different ports for home console, so we're going to begin this by looking at the worst to the best.
Excellent.
Now, I tend to look at this OG Game Boy conversion as one of the worst around. Firstly, it controls badly, collision detection is way off, without a doubt, and visually, of course, this isn't a stunning looking game. Not back then, nor is it now. The idea of Mortal Kombat was to bring realism and brutality. This is where this version epically fails. Of course, in terms of realism and that digital look, of course, the Game Boy was by far up to the task given its monochrome display, plus its inability to provide a proper digitized look. This was a poor attempt and by far not very much fun to play on this 1993 release. Johnny Cage is also not present in this port. That's down to limitations and size of Game Boy games at the time. Putting off special moves is also problematic due to only having a couple of action buttons on the OG Game Boy. Users of the Game Link cable could hook up this to another Game Boy and multiplayer could be achieved. Although this is quite an upgrade from the Game Boy version, it is still a portable 8-bit system, and so it faces some severe challenges. Having said that, despite this version being in colour, it also plays much better too. When I was hitting opponents, every hit counted and didn't seem like a major problem at all with collision detection. To be honest, this version is a huge upgrade. The music production also sounds a little better too. Both Game Boy and Game Gear had two action buttons, yet Game Gear's version just seemed easier to use. Kano was not a selectable character on the Sega Game Gear version due to memory and size of Game Gear games back then, and sadly we've only got 2 stages on the Game Gear version. To be honest, the Sega Master System is pretty much similar to the Sega Game Gear version. Of course, only the Sega Master System was for a television set rather than the portable. This again is a fairly stripped down conversion, which is understandable given the Sega Master System's limitations. So for example, we only have 2 stages to play from, just like the Game Gear counterpart, and Kano is also removed in this version. Blood and Fatalities is in this version, and apparently most of the moves found in an arcade game, and that is one of the issues with the Mortal Kombat with only 2 buttons, is it's very problematic to pull these combinations off on 2 buttons, much like the previous 2 versions I've covered so far.
Fight.
Although this conversion for the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis is the best so far on this list, was it actually really that great if put back to back with the arcade original? Although many owners of this console had this game back in the day, it came with some drawbacks and some flaws too, so really far from perfect. In this version we'll find particular missing background images, such as clouds moving in the background, and even one stage which is missing a moon, amongst other things. As you play through this port, you'll notice little parts that actually aren't in it. On top of that, some textures in the game just look really terrible. It's by far the prettiest looking version of our beloved fighting game, but at least this version felt good to control, and like this machine was man enough to partly handle the challenge of this game. Get over here! Now, what can I say about the Commodore Amiga's port of Mortal Kombat? For one, it's likely one of the best arcade conversions on the platform, and secondly, I feel that it looks as good as the Mega Drive version and plays just as well too. Just like the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis version, the Commodore Amiga also has particular imagery missing, which is understandable, and even more so for a 16-bit microcomputer. I am pretty sure that if you were still using an Amiga back in 1994 when this released, you likely would have been very pleased with this, considering some of the god-awful Amiga ports that I've covered so far in this series. Not much more really to say about this port, as it really does largely reflect the same as the Sega Mega Drive version. I only rank this one in a higher place because I'm a Commodore geek. I think back in the day you likely had arguments over which version was the best, the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, or the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version. If we take a look at the Super Nintendo version, in my opinion the game looks so much better on SNES. It just looks smoother and not as overly pixelated as the Mega Drive version. In addition to this, many stages on this 16-bits conversion had background imagery included, such as clouds and moons. Having said that, the SNES version did have some cutbacks, although I don't think it's as significant as the 16-bit Sega's conversion. For example, the SNES version has a scaled down palace in the Palace Gate stage, and you could also argue that shadows on the Sega Mega Drive port look a little better than in this version, but really that is just being nitpicky. The main criticism with this port is the lack of gore and blood, but this is Nintendo after all. They certainly had different standards back then. Really, at the end of it, SNES and Mega Drive ports both have good and bad limitations, but both control equally just fine. Today we have the PlayStation that gives us an inevitable Pro version after a few years. Back in the early 90s, Sega gave us the Sega Mega CD. Now without a doubt, this conversion deserved to be here in this list at this point. The difference between this version and the stock Sega Mega Drive or Genesis version is that this version has almost had a remaster. Sprites have been given a makeover, so red outlines aren't so obvious in this. Textures in particular, stages have been cleaned up too. There are still some missing elements such as clouds here and there, but generally you could consider this as an HD remake before HD became a thing. The audio has also got a boost too, but it sounded much fresher and louder, and rightly so. This was on a Mega CD. They named it Mega for a reason. And in first place, I put in the DOS version of this. So why did I rank a mere IBM PC compatible game in first place for a change? Well, this version truly was superior in many ways. At this point in PC gaming, games were beginning to come into their own on PCs, with massive, groundbreaking achievements being hit with games such as Doom, just for starters. Providing you had a very good computer back in 1994 and a very good sound card, you could really see the differences in most games, which was also on consoles. What improved DOS version even more is that this game came with Mortal Kombat 2 on CD-ROM when it was released, and gave it even more of an uplift than its original floppy disk release. Not arcade perfection at all, but certainly close to it, and certainly a very nice version of it to play too. It's very unlikely that a vast majority didn't have a top range computer back in 1994, but if you did, without a doubt, this was the version to go for. Anyways, that's it, and just remember that this is my personal opinions of my particular favourite ports of Mortal Kombat, and by no means is this an official list, so please no squabbling in the comments over that as usual. Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.
Finish her. Raiden wins.
In today's Ranking the Ports, and by request, we are taking a look at perhaps Taito's most famous racing games. This is Chase HQ, released back in October of 1988 for the arcades, with plenty of console, portable and home computer conversions. This game likely was loved as much as the famous Outrun. Ocean dealt with the computer ports and Taito published mainly the console ports. The game's premise is very simple: race as fast as possible to catch up with the baddies who are attempting to evade you and the law, which was actually at this point in history likely better than what it is today. You will smash into them until they catch fire and eventually halt to a stop. Several levels in the game with different stages, so as always, if there isn't a port included, my sincere apologies. The Sharp X68000 will not be included, as let's face it, this would be like going head to head with the arcade original. Emulator ports such as the Sega Saturn's version will also not be included. So let's go and catch some baddies. Good God, what was Ocean thinking with this absolute abomination? Firstly, Chase HQ is a fast game. What we have here is likely one of the slowest, if not the slowest C64 racing games of all time. The sound effect sounds like something from the Atari 2600 game, and really, what is it with the colours of the track? Light green? Since when did you know a road to be light green? Interestingly, the outside of the track kind of looks like it was ripped from the Spectrum game. Now, talking about speed, you might think that because this is so slow, it would be easier to take on corners. No, it really isn't. In fact, due to the lagginess and slow frame rates, it actually makes it seem worse. And once you crash into something as you're turning, it is extremely difficult to come back out of that crash. This 1989 Ocean release was clearly not ready to release at the time. But then again, Ocean enjoyed releasing half-baked games anyway. Absolute shocking stuff. I will mention that incoming cars appeared too big, and so crashing into them was fairly commonplace for this game. Of this day and age, with C64 multi-carts and emulation, the CPU could be whacked up to make this a little better, but even then, I highly doubt that. I was actually expecting the MSX 1990 conversion to be shockingly bad. I was surprised with this one. Yes, absolutely far from perfect, but a damn sight better and more playable than the C64's so-called port. With an almost monochrome gameplay area, the MSX version actually plays fairly well, believe it or not. Although it does have the Spectrum look, which you either love or hate this. It does suffer from frame drops, but having said that, it is totally playable considering that. A brown road is obviously better than a light green road, and that alone should gain this port a place higher up in this video. There is no music with the MSX version, and sound effects kind of reminded me of a cheap moped rather than a high-speed car, but that's the name of the game with 8-bit microgames. You win some, you lose some. Already from the footage you can see right now with this version, you can clearly see that Amstrad CPC conversion is by far light years ahead of other versions in more than just one way. Firstly, this port actually feels like you are racing. Secondly, this is kind of fun to play. It doesn't feel dreadful whilst playing it. In Amstrad fashion, we have those high contrast colours, the layout is fairly nice, and the coder behind this also knew what colour road should be, which is a bonus. It controls fairly well, and although frame rates look a little bit choppy admittedly, it is excusable given the computer specs. It's overly a decent 8-bit micro port, which most kids at the time should have been fairly happy with. The game opens up with music, it generally has a good presentation all around, although I did note that there appears to be no sound of a siren once you catch up with the enemies in this game. If you wanted to prove that the ZX Spectrum was better than Commodore 64 back in school, this was the game to compare it with. This conversion puts the C64 port to absolute shame. For a Spectrum to be this much better is a groundbreaking achievement. Everything is here with the Spec is version. The speed perception of racing, the sounds, even the music in Sirens sounds amazing. Granted, this is running on the Spectrum 128K model, but still an absolute beast of a port considering this. Of course, in true ZX Spectrum style, it is limited to colours, but that's acceptable. Is this controllable? Yes, it is. I was using Kempston joystick and this felt very tight, if not a slight bit tricky going around corners. I think people in 1989 would have been over the moon with this version, whilst laughing at the poor C64 owners with their laughing stock of a port. My first impressions with the OG Game Boy conversion is that the angle of the game seems to be too high up, so you're kind of looking down rather than in the distance, as it were. I use all of my boosts to get me further to the enemy's vehicle, but the track just seemed endless with this port. The music is, shall we say, Nintendo music, and so it sounds a little family friendly, if that makes any sense, that is. Again, just like the next version in this video, this conversion just seemed to take everything from the source material and Nintendo-fied it, if that's a word. Is this an achievement for the original Game Boy? No, not really. It's a standard racing game and there is much better for the classic Game Boy. This version is overly boring to play and controlling your car left and right gave no depth to the game at all, just felt very bland in fact. The NES version is actually titled as Taito Chase HQ pretty much with all these console ports. This one released in 1990. I have to say that this just seemed far too easy. It felt and looked like a generic Nintendo NES 8-bit racing game and just seemed to have taken away anything that resembled the arcade game. For example, the rough roads where you crash through the barriers isn't in this version, and the music just seems to not go with this port at all. Speed perception is there, but controlling the car just felt like I was steering on ice. It wasn't too great. It didn't have that oomph whilst steering corners. In true Nintendo style, just like yesterday's Altered Beast video that I did, this version is kind of hard to judge because although it is a direct port, it is also very different to the others here. I personally think that the Sega Game Gear's 8-bit portable wiped the floor with Game Boy OG's conversion. Firstly, the viewing angle is much better with the Game Gear. Secondly, although Game Boy has monochrome, and that can help that, this game just looks much nicer in colour. It controls so much better and just feels that much more like the original version of Chase HQ. I am pretty sure that most kids of the time would have laughed at the Game Boy's version for more than one reason or another. Is it a great version on Game Gear? Of course, for Chase HQ's couple of portable versions that it received at the time, this 1991 release was very good for its time. If you didn't own a console back then, this was likely the next best thing available to play at home. Now, in comparison to the NES port of Chase HQ, the Sega Master System does a cracking job of it when compared to that version. This just seems like a much more faithful and thought of version of this 8-bit platform. Controls were squeaky clean and just seemed very enjoyable to play. Okay, so it has enabled made cutbacks to the original arcade version, such as objects and buildings on the side of the road, which is understandable. Not everything could transfer easily onto lower spec hardware. Braking and drifting around corners was very responsive, and the colours used was very acceptable given the Master System colour palette in use. When catching up with the enemy, bashing the car, it felt actually good in this version too, like it didn't seem like a chore to do either. A very nice port indeed. Sega Master System owners likely would have been happy with this version back in the day. In terms of getting more of the true arcade look, such as objects on the side of roads, such as trees and buildings and signs, the Atari ST port is very good with some nice colours used in this version too. I did find this conversion a little on the stiff side of turning right and left, and I did find myself crashing a lot with this too. We can either have sound effects or music in this version, but sadly not both. Music to me sounds much like an 8-bit sound and not much like a 16-bit computer of the time. It's pretty much 99% similar to the next version apart from the music quality. The Commodore Amiga version of the game wasn't actually that bad. I felt that the only true thing preventing some good gameplay was the controls seemed very much off. It was very difficult to handle, especially when turning corners. On average, the visuals weren't the worst, but certainly wasn't the best either. We have an option with this conversion to enable or disable music and sound effects or vice versa. The music is superb and the sound effects are pretty acceptable too. Colours used are nice, although this version did kind of reminds me of Space Harrier, oddly enough. Speed perception is definitely up there too. Hitting the enemy's cars also felt average. Like I say, nothing groundbreaking, but a fairly average, if not mediocre, Amiga arcade conversion. Next up, and in second place, I have put the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 port right just here. Because although it is a nice version and totally playable, I did find that this conversion had far too many turns to make, and the speed of the car, even when braking, was just too difficult to make most of these turns without crashing. Nice music with some great sound effects, and a really nice choice of colours used in this version. It's also, I think, one of the better PC Engine games on this platform. Without a doubt, the version is one of the most challenging on all platforms that I've covered in this video due to its increased difficulty level because of all those extra turns that the developers chose to put in this version. Everything else is fine. It is a version that is certainly worth playing if increased difficulty whilst playing a good port is your cup of tea. And in first place, the FM Towns 1990 version by Taito is a fairly faithful port of the Chase HQ original. As you can see in gameplay, it's not 100% perfected, but undeniably this version is visually stunning and it even changes the times of the day when you travel. So early examples of dynamic weather, I suppose. For example, we go from daytime and then it fades into nighttime. It is responsive to control and generally feels like a well put together game, complete with sound effects, which doesn't sound like a moped. Braking, that sounds good, and this is also featuring background music at the same time. The radio used in the game also sounds really good, much like the arcade original in fact. Speed perception is spot on. This really is a great arcade conversion and likely lesser known amongst many of the other versions in this video. This for me was a close call between the PC Engine conversion. That version didn't make first place literally because of its volume of difficult turns to make. So anyways, that's it for the Chase HQ battle with the ports, I suppose, if that's what you want to call it these days on this channel. Let me know in the comments about your memories of Chase HQ, if you had the ZX Spectrum or the C64 version. Which version would you personally rank as #1? And as always, I'm always asking for people to give me some ideas or some suggestions of which arcade port videos you want to see. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. Now, today's arcade ports video is going to seem a little odd for such a basic game, and surely you couldn't possibly get a bad version of Bobble, surely. They must all be pretty good, right? Honestly, it wasn't until I began researching for this video and playing it on various platforms that this theory is in fact inaccurate. After all, you could say the same for Pac-Man, but any knowledgeable retro enthusiast would likely tell you straight up that the Atari 2600 conversion was shockingly bad. Bobble for me has a history. It was one of the games I had for Christmas of 1990 for my Commodore 64 back then, and it was also a version on the NES I would play religiously back in the day. After a recent request to do this video, we are going through the weird and wonderful arcade ports of Taito's 1986 release of Bobble and ranking, as always, from worst to best. To note, Game Boy original version is a different game with different layouts and intro, so that one won't be included in this video. Prior being asked to do this video from a subscriber, I honestly thought that something as basic as Bobble seriously couldn't have a bad version. After all, it's a creature that blows bubbles into cutesy enemies and smashes them afterwards. This seemed like a task for the Apple II conversion released in 1989 by Taito themselves. I get that this computer is a 1970s computer, and that's fine, but if you need to deviate so far away from what it is you are looking to imitate, why bother at all? Firstly then, the cute introduction with Bob and Bob hovering with that cool music and storyline with bubbles flying around, it's not in this version. Now, that's not a big issue. The big issue is when enemies appear on screen. The first stage, I was actually wondering if the floppy disk image was broken. Then randomly they appeared, two at a time, and every now and again one would totally disappear altogether. I also found myself dying for no reason in this version. The cool game music is gone during the stages, and we get a partially recognizable tune when it skips to the next round, which in itself isn't smooth transition like most other versions. Collision detection is pretty good, and colours are average for this computer. Sprites aren't particularly smooth though, as seen in the gameplay footage. Now, really, what can I say about this Firebird Amstrad CPC release? I will just say it's playable and a big improvement over the Apple II's conversion. This port features no music at all, even between stages, no music. It's just got the annoying sound of jumping. I did notice that there is a fair bit of frame drop when several sprites are present on screen at once. There is also a little bit of flicker on sprites every now and again. The use of colours are nice, as the CPC generally has nice contrasty vibrant colours in its games, although sprites were kind of pixelated. I also noticed that even shooting bubbles seemed very wooden, so to speak, when blowing them out. It just wasn't particularly fun port to play at all, and whilst collecting goodies after smashing into enemies, instead of a cute collecting sound, it sounded like generic shoot 'em up music. Like I say, an improvement over the Apple II version. At least here I only died when actually getting hit. Some of you watching this likely would not know what a BBC Micro is, especially for people outside of Britain. It was an Acorn computer who did a deal with the BBC in the early 1980s for its computer literacy program. I personally used one at school in the late 1980s. Surprisingly, we had a fairly good Firebird port of Bobble here. Is it groundbreaking? No, but just like the Apple II version, considering everything, this is a very good port, and of course by no means an educational game at all. This version even opens up with the introduction with bubbles popping out from the centre of the screen, whereas most ports of the game didn't have this. The letdown for the BBC version is its slow paced. In that I mean its slow frame rate. There is no transition between stages on this port either. Most versions will see Bob and Bob drop down to the next screen or stage. This version loads the next screen, but the music stays consistent without having to stop at all. The combination of very fast music with very slow gameplay is a strange mixture to have, to be honest. The music itself is pretty typical Atari ST style, a 16-bit computer which sounds more like an 8-bit computer. So is this game better being slow? Well, no, it does tend to drag a little. At the beginning of each stage, enemies drop down to their positions, which normally gives the player a chance to work out where they are starting from in each level. The Atari ST version seems to increase the waiting time before each stage begins. We also have the border on the right hand side of the screen, and there's actually no Bob waiting for player 2 either in the bottom right hand side. It does drop slightly in frame rate, and most certainly not the best 16-bit computer version of Bobble here. The ZX Spectrum release by Firebird is a real surprise and joy to play. Okay, so it has some cutbacks, which, as always, I say this is acceptable given the ZX Spectrum's hardware limitations. The introduction to this port is missing, and that's not a great deal breaker, but we are, after all, looking for the best overall port of the arcade classic. Not to say this conversion is bad at all. For a Spectrum, it is wonderful to hear very nice music production. Although I did find whenever Bub jumped, it kind of sounded a little bit strange compared to other versions. But this was the 80s after all, and for some reason developers like to give a sound of jumping. It's just the way it was. Obviously, Spectrum is limited to just a few colours simultaneously, but considering all of this, it's a great 8-bit micro port, and it runs so smoothly too, as well as changes to new stages. A real treat for Spectrum users back in 1987. So like I said in the introduction, the Game Boy port is very different to everything else here, and this Game Gear port remains true to the arcade source material. Now, firstly, this is a great portable 8-bit conversion of Bobble, but like most other 8-bit portable games, there has been some sacrifices made due to memory constraints. This might be a little bit nitpicky, but we don't have the border of the gameplay screen on the left and right hand side of the stages in this version, just the top and the bottom. Not a complete deal breaker, but still. Secondly, the transitions between each stage pauses the music for a split second and repeats the music again once that stage starts. And so music isn't consistent, which sounds a little irritating if I'm honest. On the plus side, this is still a really great port and even features a proper introduction, complete with those bubbles too. We also have no Bob on the bottom right hand side for player 2 to start, which is cool. After all, the Sega Game Gear was a one-player affair. This is a version I had as a kid, and regretfully it isn't the best conversion of the bunch here. I must remain pragmatic and focus on everything, so it's kind of a mixture of the Spectrum and Amstrad for this Firebird port, although the music production is of higher quality thanks to the best sound chip of the 80s 8-bit computers, the mighty SID chip. Now realistically, yes, it is a good conversion for reasons of steady frame rate, smooth sprite control, and generally a decent version of play. The sprites, however, do look a little on the larger side, and pixelation is pretty evident too. One noticeable difference with the Commodore 64's Firebird's conversion is there is an abundance of goodies to collect. The jump-in sounds aren't so annoying in this version either, and just like a couple of other ports, we have the table on the right hand side. The introduction, however, is semi-complete, although it's missing the shooting bubbles. Now, on first glance, the Commodore Amiga game looks great. Okay, it's got a table or border on the right-hand side, which isn't how it was originally, and Bob isn't animated in the bottom right-hand corner asking for player 2 to join. So we have a couple of cutbacks, which is cool, but the real issue here with the Amiga port is the speed of this game. And for a Bobble veteran like myself, this was simply a speed I haven't ever been used to playing with. The music, of course, is spot on. This is an Amiga game after all, an area where music actually excelled on. We do have an intro too, but no bubbles. It's just a shame about the extreme speed of this version, otherwise it could have landed itself a slightly higher place. Everything else here is great, and it's got very smooth scrolling too. Now, although the IBM PC compatible DOS conversion isn't actually that bad, controller actually feels just a little on the sensitive side, and the game plays at a slightly faster rate too. The music and sound effects are obviously the sounds of that computer era, but that isn't a bad thing. This nice little version of that awesome music works really well here, as the game moved much quicker and to jump was actually up on the joystick rather than having a dedicated action button. It seemed a little alien to me playing it this way. One thing I did notice is that whenever a single enemy remains on screen, they generally turn a different colour before it's speed enough to hunt you down. That wasn't the case here though. Enemies remain the same colour. It is a silky smooth game to play, and it actually surprised me how well it played too. The DOS version also had a border on the right hand side of the screen, which is obviously not how the 1986 original arcade game was. Surprisingly, the Japanese Famicom Disk System conversion features no cute bubbles or sparkly stars within its introduction of the game. Not an utter deal breaker at all, but given this is an old school Nintendo game, cute things like this, especially for its time, should have been included, surely. No Bob waiting for player 2 to join. One thing that really did stick out to me is that the colours used in this Famicom Disk System conversion appear to be fairly darker in contrast compared with everything else here I've tested. Its transitions with consistent music when travelling from one stage to another are there. It plays really well, although there is better ports to cover in this video. The MSX2 1987 conversion direct from Taito is a superb port of Bobble. It's bright and vibrant and also features that full screen rather than having the table on the right hand side like a lot of versions did have. Okay, so no bubbles at the beginning of the game that pop out from the centre of the screen, and we don't have Bob on the bottom right hand side waiting for player 2 to join. The good things with the MSX2 conversion is pretty much everything else. Sound effects are almost spot on with the original arcade game. For example, when bashing into an enemy after being caught with a bubble, the sound is very nice for this, and also picking up goodies which are scattered around the screen sounds really good with the MSX2 conversion. The transition between stages are also very smooth, and so are the sprites themselves. It's a very impressive port on the MSX2. If it wasn't for the sprite flicker and lack of animated bubbles for the introduction, then this childhood favourite of mine would have easily been higher up in this list. But again, we need to be pragmatic. The arcade game didn't flicker, and we need to be nitpicky here really. We are still looking for arcade perfection, remember. In terms of everything, there really isn't much wrong with this version. Like I say, we are being nitpicky. It's definitely a colourful conversion and reeks in Nintendo 8-bit style music of the Bubble tune. Again, Bob is missing in this version. This isn't an absolutely bad version. Like I say, the only reason it's not further up on this list is due to that sprite flicker. An absolute love letter to the original arcades game. This features everything but that two-player Bob in the right-hand side. Opens up with a lovely animated introduction complete with bubbles too, And we also get the 4 borders surrounding gameplay area here, unlike its Game Gear counterpart. Sprites move very smoothly and the colours are really awesome too with this Master System version. If you had this version growing up, you were very close to having arcade games in your bedroom or living room. The sound effects are very similar to the source material and sprites aren't overly pixelated. Obviously, the table on your right hand side isn't here either, so we have a full screen too. From what I have played of this version, there is no frame rate issues and sprite flicker doesn't seem to happen with the Master System port of this game. The FM Towns version is near arcade perfect and includes everything from the original 1986 arcade game. We finally have a 2-player Bob sprite waiting to join in the bottom right hand corner, an introduction with flying bubbles and perfect scrolling too. A complete fluid game that even gives us full options in its options menu, which ranges from enabling the original or arcade version, different ratios of gameplay, that's aspect ratio, music and sound effects options. This 1990 release, brought to us by Ving, included everything and more for our beloved arcade platformer. Now right here I decided to rank the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn ports together because frankly when these released in the mid 1990s the hardware wasn't particularly a struggle to get these games running, given that both platforms were actually 32-bit. In terms of perfection, these can be a little over-perfected to the point where sprites look a little more enhanced. I felt that ranking these separately would seem pointless because they virtually look and play the same. Of course, these ports couldn't make it to first place because we're looking for arcade perfection, and like I mentioned, both of these ports are enhanced, as you can see with the Bub and Bob sprites. I am ranking the Sharp X68000 conversion as the closest we'll ever get to an arcade port. This 1990 release by Tempo was pretty much arcade perfection without needing to enhance the sprites like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn conversions did. This plays just like the original and certainly looks the part too. If these two were actually put together, you would see very little difference. Of course, the Sharp X68000 computer was pretty much the development kit for many Capcom CPS games. However, this is a Taito game after all. The clear best of the bunch and was released during the original releases for Bubble Bobble home ports. So anyways, that's comparing all the different ports of Bubble Bobble. So let me know in the comments which you would have ranked in first place, or do you think the ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64 version deserved a higher spot in this video? As always, behave yourself in the comments, and until next video, thanks for watching. Today we are comparing the ports of a game that would cause you despair and distress as a child or even adult when it released by Capcom back in 1985. We aren't talking about the theme of Ghosts and Goblins, we are talking the sheer difficulty level here. You will die over and over again, you would have lost a lot of money not to even reach the second stage. The arcade game would leave you stressed out but wanting to play this again. A total love-hate relationship, as many popular arcade games in the 1980s, we got several home console computer versions, some great, some not so great. If I miss a port in this video, I truly do apologise. As always in my ports videos, we will start from the worst and work to what I personally consider as the most faithful to the arcade original. Now let us guide Sir Arthur to rescue Princess Prim Prim from Satan. Let's begin then by looking at the Commodore 16 conversion. As you can see in the gameplay, it is extremely basic and really looks older than its release of 1986. Of course, the Commodore 64 was much superior in many ways, and that reflects gameplay here. Something else to consider is the Commodore 16 was a replacement for the Commodore VIC-20. Let's put it like this then, the Commodore Plus 4 was considered higher end to this, and most know how basic that was. Is it a good game to play? Let's just say very basic, to the point where Arthur's animation doesn't change when he climbs ladders. Most annoyingly, once Arthur is hit once, you are dead. Unlike most other versions here, his armor will fall off and give the player another chance. No music and very basic sound effects. It is frustrating to play and actually reminds me more of the Hobgoblin Ghosts and Goblins clone rather than what it is trying to imitate. Lastly, if you need to duck for cover, don't expect a ducking function with the Commodore 16 conversion. Welcome to the bizarre land of DOS gaming, 1980s style. Now, firstly, the sprite design and colours used are pretty nice in this version. For the sounds that DOS games had back in the mid to late 1980s, the sound isn't that bad too for what it actually is. Now, on with the bad then. Firstly, Arthur kind of feels like he is floating when jumping. Physics with weight is totally bizarre here. This version doesn't multi-scroll either. It is a single screen affair, and that can get a little frustrating by not knowing what's lurking around on the next screen you visit. Range of weapon thrown is very short too, which means you have to fairly get close to enemies to kill them. The gargoyle is missing halfway through too. And finally, when you do reach the end of the first stage, the first boss appears to die. Whilst I'm waiting for the key to drop, he comes back. I kill him again, he disappears. On the third time he dies and the key then drops. Is this version good? It's interesting. We will just leave it there. The NEC PC88 conversion of this is a very frustrating one to play. Firstly, although this is a multi-scrolling version, it is very choppy as you can see in the gameplay. I tried different models of the PC88 and adjusted CPU speeds accordingly, and this was really the best settings I could get for this. It's a combination of poor frame rates combined with background colours used, which really make the game suffer. It's definitely a tough version, and the gargoyle doesn't leave you alone. Even if you manage to dodge past it, it will hunt you down without a doubt. No opening sequence in the PC88 version. Music and sound effects are average for a PC88 game. It controls fairly well, and at least it feels more like the source material compared with the poor DOS version. For Amstrad, for Britain, we had three big 8-bit microcomputers, Spectrum, C64 and the Amstrad. Of course, many others came and went, but growing up, these were the three biggest. It normally seems that Amstrad gets the worst ports, and I think that is unfair considering it is a very capable machine. This is the case with the 1986 Elite release of Ghosts and Goblins. Firstly, the music seems to be a remix of some kind that kind of makes you feel like you are in some hardcore rave. I wasn't sure to play the game or invite friends around to some happy hardcore party. Anyways, the game itself isn't the best. Certainly it resembles the source material, but almost with its own ideas. For example, the gargoyle appears after you cross the moving block to cross to the forest. And the worst thing of this is that, just like the Commodore 16 version, you don't have an armor to protect you. One hit and you are dead, it's that simple. For Amstrad fans, in the last few years, we have been blessed by a GX4000 remake, as well as a 6128 Plus remake. Look them up on Google. Now, admittedly, the ZX Spectrum is very bare bones, and to some extent could be seen to slightly resemble the NEC PC-88 port, but trust me when I say that this plays really well. Okay, so it lacks music and sound effects are very rudimental too, but bypass this, and like I say, you have a lovely and quintessentially piece of British 8-bit microcomputer gaming history here. This version even comes with an introduction. Color clash can at first seem a little off-putting, but I have said before in videos that comes with the ZX Spectrum territory, especially in the old days of programming for it. It controls really well too with nice collision detection. The only annoying thing with this version is that as soon as you start the game, you move right, Arthur doesn't move at all. You soon realise that there's actually a tombstone right next to him from the get-go. Firstly, let's remind ourselves that this C64 game released back in 1986, and so games for this platform were just about ripening up with coders to make games look better after a few years of experimenting with what the C64 could and couldn't do. Is the C64 conversion by Elite any good? Yes it is. Although it is on the pixelated side, it is a nice 8-bit home computer port that plays well with very nice controller function. This actually received an update arcade version a good few years back where it was improved on too. Gameplay footage is the original release though for this video. One good thing about this version is that the gargoyle midway through stage 1 is fairly easy to defeat. We have no introduction for this version, it plumps us straight into round 1 from the get-go. The music is totally different too, but that's not a bad thing. The music by Mark Cooksey is top notch, and we also get some sound. When Arthur dies, this actually sounds remarkably similar to the arcade game. Overall, a nice port with fairly average difficulty level. Although the 1990 Elite release of Ghosts and Goblins on the Atari ST looks great and plays really nice too, if not a touch on the hard side, the real issue here is the zoomed in look where sprites are much larger than its arcade source. Granted, during stage 2 we make blind jumps, but for stage 1 to do this was a little strange. Like I say, by no means bad at all. It's a really nice version of the game with some nice music and sound effects as well as colours that are pretty faithful to the original arcade version. Sprite design is really nice too in this version, and like every other version, sprite collision is pretty much spot on. Developers made damn sure that kids and adults would suffer through this regardless of the platform this game was put onto. I think many ST users in the early 90s would have really enjoyed this port at the time. As much as the Game Boy Color port is wonderful, it plays nicely and it looks great, granted, we are still looking for arcade accuracy here. As always, I must remain pragmatic and dismiss eye candy over practicality. Yes, this looks nice, but just like the Atari ST conversion, this one is too zoomed in. As another example, Arthur blind jumps from the first stage off the hill we climbed up, whereas the source material had no blind jumps on the first stage. We will take into exception that is portable version, but still, to be nitpicky, there are other platforms on the Color which aren't zoomed in like this, Mario for example. As a game, it is definitely worth a purchase and play. It plays silky smooth and does have some nice music and sound effects, and like other ports here, it tends to get off on being extremely difficult. A seriously great 8-bit console port for this NES 1986 release, the conversion sets the scene with an introduction where Arthur's girlfriend is taken away, and it also displays the map of which stage you're about to face. It is a very responsive game to control, and did find this version really enjoyable to play. There is of course plenty of sprite flicker going on, but like I say in these videos, that really is part and parcel of Nintendo NES. If you played or grew up with a NES, this minor issue can easily be overlooked. In terms of music quality and sound effects, Ghosts and Goblins on the NES had both really, and both sound very good too. Graphics and sprite animation for a NES game of this period, which was 1986, was very good too. Considering the NES console itself was fairly new at this point, and many games were fairly basic too in the background behind this game. Nevertheless, good lord, this game is just as challenging as an arcade game, if not even harder. In terms of 16-bit home computer accuracy to the arcade game, the Commodore Amiga's 1990 released by Elite is way up there with its nice smooth graphics and nicely detailed sprite design and awesome controller response. The music and sound effects are very close to the source material that it was copying, and it just seemed like a really enjoyable home conversion of the arcade classic. It doesn't have frame drop issues, and it's very fluid to play too. Now, this was a close call between the Nintendo NES conversion and this version, of course, and to be honest, as always, I look for accuracy. And although NES and Amiga both look great and play really awesome too, the Amiga's music just sounds a little truer to the original source material, the arcade game. And that's it for today's ranking the Ghosts and Goblin ports. Now, just remember, this is my personal opinion. How I rank these, it's not official. If you're new to the channel, if you've not seen it, I've also done the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, which is of course a very awesome Ghouls and Ghosts, so do check that one out. And also drop a line in the comments section and let me know which version you perhaps might have chose to be in top spot. Which version did you grow up with? Anyways, until next time. Let's give Commando some context. The 1980s was a decade of over-the-top, action-packed films and even TV series. Even if it wasn't action-packed, it would have the Vietnam maybe as its background, the A-Team to name one. Remember, the 80s was a decade of explosive, in-your-face excess, and it was definitely one of the best decades for the rise of action stars. Yes, the 80s was without a doubt a friggin' awesome time for popular culture, an exciting but oddly paranoid decade where things were rapidly changing. Now, I think some might confuse the Commando game with the ridiculously over-the-top Arnold Schwarzenegger film with the same name, but it isn't related to the film at all, although technically it could have been. Commando, or its Japanese name Senjou no Okami, was released back in 1985 by those pioneer wizards at Capcom. Now, generally, many of my arcade ports videos have had some shockingly bad home conversions. This isn't the case here. Commando mainly seems to have a decent conversion for most platforms that I am covering in this video. As always, if I have missed a port, I truly apologise, but have covered the main systems here. Okay then, so let's go and annihilate some enemy scum. As you'll see in the gameplay, this game was a constant battle of survival for me. More frustratingly, once reaching stage 2, the player is literally lined up with an enemy missile where you had to be very quick to avoid it, otherwise instant death. The Commodore 16 game is divided into sections, unlike how it should be by scrolling vertically. That's fine, but why do the heads of enemies pop up like one of those arcade games where you use a mallet to whack down the things that pop up? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Commando, Commodore 16 style. Does it look authentic and play like the classic 1985 Capcom game? Well, is the Pope a Catholic? This so-called conversion could have been written with a different name to begin with. Held on a floppy disk and then released as Commando, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary back in this era. This game will make you very angry very quickly. It's just not worth it at all. I'd imagine if you own this version as a kid, you likely would have binned the cassette or disc in pure rage. For viewers outside the UK, it is unlikely you would have heard of an Acorn Electron. What was this? Well, it was pretty much a cut down version of the BBC Micro, which was set up as a BBC educational computer, which was extremely expensive back in the early 1980s. So as you can see here, the colours are very typical of the Acorn Electron, greens and reds in very high in contrast. Although this conversion tried to imitate its source material really well, the Electron could not handle such a fast-paced arcade shooter. It is sluggish to control and does suffer with frame rate drops significantly. This is being handled with only 32k of RAM, so we can take that into account. There is no introduction with being dropped into stage 1, and there is no music, just a couple of 8-bit micro rudimentary sound effects. I am sure this would have made a few kids happy when it released on cassette back in 1986. Definitely not the best version for the 8-bit microcomputers. I'm also adding the BBC Micro conversion to this ranking in this list, as it is virtually the same as the Electron version, as you can see here in the gameplay. Commando on the Atari 2600, yes, this happened back in 1988 and Activision published it. Now normally when you think of the 2600, very basic games likely come into mind, such as Missile Command or Asteroids. You know what? The coder behind this conversion actually did a superb job with porting over Commando on this 1977 console. Again, just like in my Double Dragon ports video, by 1988 most kids were playing much more advanced home consoles or home computers. Of course, this cut down version is missing several things from the first stage at least. The hostage being taken away by 2 enemies, for example, isn't in this version, and also being dropped off by the helicopter isn't here. Neither is a motorbike riding across the bridge halfway through the first stage. And throwing grenades isn't as great and is effective in some other versions, but the basic idea and principle is here, and it is totally playable and even has a very primitive sounding military drum roll music and some very nice sound effects. I won't slam this version at all because it just seems like the work of a genius. Even the scrolling speed and sprites are really smooth with the 2600 version. Okay, so granted, the Mattel Intellivision released back in 1980, and this era isn't really much talked about, but good lord, this must have been very impressive at the time. Remember, this was before C64, the Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as many more computers and consoles which arrived in the 1980s. Impressive in that the music blew me away with this port when I was expecting a rudimentary sound like something from the Atari 2600. Given just 3 years space of the 2600 release and this console releasing, technology was leap years ahead. Although it definitely looks like a game of this era, and the Intellivision had a questionable controller which looked like a phone to some extent, or the Atari Jaguar controller, this game plays really well. Vertical scrolling is very smooth, collision detection is almost spot on, but what I mainly fixated on was my player's movements. Call me a geek, but I think the sprite was really nicely designed as he walked along on the screen. This is definitely a challenging game, and it even included that hostage being dragged along by 2 enemies midway through the first stage. No helicopter drop, but hey, this is a game from 1987 utilising 1980 technology. Welcome to the Sprite Flicker Festival 2024. This is the MSX1 conversion by AC Corporation, which was only released in Japan and also known as Senjo no Kami, which translates to Wolf of the Battlefield. Now, as you can see here, it looks like what it's attempting to look like, but seriously fails on a couple of things. As you can see, the sprite flicker is atrocious on the MSX, to the point where bullets can kill you without you even being aware that the bullet was heading straight towards you. The game has far too much going on at the same time, and it will lag very badly towards the end of the first stage when the sudden influx of baddies emerge from the gate. Not a great version at all. I rated it here literally due to looking more like the arcade version than the others I have ranked so far. Although there isn't anything wrong with this 1985 ZX Spectrum Elite conversion, let's bear in mind that the point of this video is to determine the closest version to the original arcades game. So just like many other conversions in this list, we have also had cutbacks here. This port plays tremendously well, but there's no music and some very basic beeper sound effects, which us Specky fans love anyways. It plays well too and nicely presents us with some very smooth scrolling action, complete with enemies and the player itself, which all scroll fantastically. As always, Spectrum is limited to how many colours it displays on screen at the same time. The gameplay is definitely there, and it is by no means a bad version of the arcade original at all, it just looks different. Now forget that we don't have that muddy look, we have a black playing ground instead, but the IBM compatible DOS version plays really well. Yes, the beeper sounds are pretty bad, but the mechanics are there with this version, although a little slow admittedly compared with some other versions. Sprite collision is very good here too, much like the ZX Spectrum port. The only thing that is missing are those colours, which this version also lacks. A mediocre DOS game in a time when DOS conversions were fairly terrible on average. Not a great deal of frame drops in this version, neither do sprites flicker. It's a very good game really. Kids and adults in 1985 would have been delighted with this Amstrad CPC conversion, also by Elite. I don't often praise CPC ports much, but we have this as an exception, as well as Chase HQ, which I also covered the other day, which was very impressive too. This version is a solid port despite its frame drops when the screen gets busy. This can always be expected when too much is happening at once in micro games. The game is nice to control, and when firing the range is nice, and bombs also do a lot of damage too. It's a great colourful port that has nice sprite animations and offers a challenge which matches that of the arcade's original, as well as some nicely composed music and sound effects which fit the arcade sound really nicely. A seriously great port for an 8-bit microcomputer. The one thing which doesn't make this any higher in this list is the drop in frame rates, and of course we also lack the helicopter dropping us into stage 1. Up next, we have the Atari 7800 conversion from 1989. Now, in comparison to the 7800's older brother, the 2600, this 7800 port is more true to the original arcade game. Of course, the 7800 was more capable of handling things and could do this title a little bit more justice. So, we start the game just like the source material, being dropped into the war zone by the helicopter. Vertical scrolling is extremely smooth, as well as the sprite animations themselves. Music and sound effects are also very cool too. I particularly like the enemies dying animation in this version. I also noticed that the addition of extra couple of pickups in stage 1 were included here, such as new guns and even a knife. Grenade range and damage is pretty authentic here too. This is a great port which kind of looks like a cross between a C64 and Nintendo NES game. Now, I know this opinion will likely be dismissed by console lovers, but in the context of this video, we are, after all, looking for the most accurate port right next to the arcade version. Now, firstly, I don't think that the NES conversion is very bad at all, but as we play through this, sprites and even the vertical scrolling isn't too wonderful. Lots of sprite flicker going on, even for a NES game that is. Now, a good thing about this version is that not only do we get a fabulous helicopter drop us in to begin the mission, but there are even hidden underground sections where we can rescue hostages. I didn't include this in the video as we are mainly looking at the main stage and comparing it to the arcade layout. Something else within this version is that the first mission seems endless. Most other versions are fairly cut short. I would imagine that because Commando is a fairly short game, Nintendo needed to lengthen it in order to justify its, say, £45 to £50 price tag. Arguably some of the best music ever produced on the Commodore 64 during this decade by the genius Sid musician Rob Hubbard, this Commando conversion by Elite is an absolute joy to play. It is smooth and could easily be mistaken as a console game. We also had a superb remake of this game a few years back which went by the title Commando Arcade, which made this original port even better. On this Elite release, it is missing a helicopter entrance for the game, but that is about it. Much like most other versions, it was coded to give us a full screen rather than how it originally looked in the arcade, which was a bit of a bummer, but old school TVs didn't have different aspect ratio changes back in those days. I have muted the sound on this version due to copyright, but seriously, the Rob Hubbard music is some of the best on the C64. Although the Atari ST conversion looks great and it plays and looks very similar to what it's attempting to replicate, the port actually suffers from some serious frame rate issues, really starting from the start of the first mission this happens. Sure, it includes everything that you would expect to see in a home computer port of this very awesome arcade game. It's a real shame with this port. It is of course playable, but due to the immense slowdown frame rates, it can make the game that much more unnecessarily difficult. I found that to match the near arcade quality, including music and the presentation, the Commodore Amiga wins this port more easily. Firstly, our all-important hero drops from the helicopter and gives his comrades a nice little wave goodbye, which only a couple of conversions added this. The helicopter itself is nicely animated too, and the vertical ratio was the closest to the original 1985 arcade game too. I would imagine that most ports didn't want to do this, as domestic TV sets back then didn't have different ratio adjustments like we do today, and so most developers preferred the full screen for home TVs rather than having those black bars on the right and left hand sides. Everything seems to be included for the Amiga version. Painful difficulty level and almost faded colour palette used to give it an overall dusty and worn out Warzone effect. It controls really nicely, and damn, once those bullets hit you, you are dead. Absolutely no fooling collision detection in this Commodore Amiga version. So that's it for today's ranking the Commando ports. Let me know in the comments section which you personally thought was the best port out of all of these from the 1985 classic, and which version did you play growing up. And as always, if there's a particular arcade game ports video you want me to upload, just drop a line in the comments section. Anyways, thanks for watching. Gauntlet was brought to us in arcades by Atari Games back in 1985. I remember this one as a kid in holiday camps, but it always seemed to have older players around it, with a haze of smoke generally. Arguably one of Atari Games' most memorable games through its chaotic battles of the undead, a game that had a hell of a lot happening simultaneously on the screen, which was very unusual. Yes, one might consider this a game for the geeks, as to some extent it had that Dungeons and Dragons setting, which was very popular at the time of this release, and the world had just seen a satanic panic too. If you were into hair metal, glam metal, or rock in general in the mid-80s, you most definitely likely were a Satanist of the highest order possible, and if you happened to be a fan of Gauntlet too, you were most definitely going to the depths of hell for this, without a doubt. Gauntlet was a mean game that required you to battle through darkest dungeons, taking on evil, collecting keys, unlocking doors, destroying portals, and finally exit the higher stages. For its time, the use of voice synthesizers in a game would have been very unusual and likely drew people in too through its innovation within the arcade. To know, Amiga's 2012 homebrew version will not be included, as this is considered an aftermarket release, and also the Nintendo Entertainment System version will also not be included, as this version was a mix-up of Gauntlet 1 and 2 and did not follow the same structure as the original arcade game. If I'm missing out a version here, I sincerely apologise, so let's go battle Satan himself. Owners of the Apple II computer would have been treated in 1988 with the Mindscape conversion of Gauntlet, but was it actually a good port? Well, we would just say it functions to some extent. Of course, as in gameplay footage you can see very poor frame drops within the gameplay from scratch pretty much. Of course, when you are overwhelmed with creatures of the night who are aiming to destroy you, this brings down the frame rate even further, in which using a controller to fire seems paused and takes a moment to remember the button you've actually requested. It looks acceptable for an Apple II game, but not particularly a fun game to play by any means. It's far too slow for its own good, with some very primitive sounds incorporated. This 16-bit Apple IIgs conversion is a massive upgrade from the original Apple II's conversion of Gauntlet in more ways than one. Firstly, the GS looks much nicer, almost like Mindscape in 1988 actually had some care with this version. It runs smoother and it does look the part, although admittedly it is very pixelated. Of course, the difference between 8 and 16-bit games will always be a big factor to consider, but really that shouldn't be the case. The original 1986 Apple II game really was just terrible. I actually used my keyboard to control this version, and it was fairly responsive as far as keyboards get with a game of this age. Magic, when used, worked well when requested, and also had some light sound effects too, which weren't too groundbreaking to be honest. The wizard who was playing as in this version sounded more like he was striking a match rather than throwing balls of fire. One thing that is a bit strange with this port is its blue border. Every other microcomputer conversion used black. That kind of adds a little more darkness to the gameplay areas. Light blue just doesn't signify terror. Now, regretfully, the Atari 800 or Atari 8-bit conversion isn't too wonderful. Sound effects are on par with most other 8-bit Atari games. As you will see in the gameplay footage, I could not map this out correctly, and so was controlling two characters at the same time as a two-player game. You will see some noise being generated. This was likely down to either bad programming or the fact that I had joystick ports the wrong way around. Anyways, the game itself is fairly average, nothing spectacular. It does look nicer than, say, the Apple II conversion, and scrolling wasn't too bad either for this conversion. Really though, you can do a lot better than the Atari 8-bit port. The IBM PC compatible conversion almost seemed very similar to the C64's version, in that very similar colours was used, yet looked nicer as almost like a spiritual upgrade in this department. Sprites are a little more detailed in this DOS version too. The game does seem like it is struggling to keep up with the action, and of course this does slow her down when more enemies are on the screen at once. I think a cut down of enemies likely would have made this Mindscape release a little more fluid to play. Sound effects are very typical for this era, which is the old-fashioned beeper sound effects. Okay, so as some of you are likely aware, my first system growing up was a C64. I knew a Gauntlet from Holiday Camp Arcades, but in general, these had crowds around them, which I was always blocked out of to see what the game was really actually like. Now, for the game, firstly, like other ports, to have so much happening on screen at once would have been a difficult task for any coder for programming one of these micro 8-bit computers. Surprisingly, although it was not chaotic in terms of enemies as the arcade original, the C64 actually puts up a good fight of making this happen to some extent. Yes, the game is pretty dull in terms of colour, and the only voice synthesizer is that of the character you play as when he or her gets hurt. The original arcade machine game would also have information pop up to guide the player and just generally give the player information over what does what in the game. The game fully playable of course, but doesn't really give you the overall arcade experience. It doesn't lag as one might expect it to, and it actually does a fairly good job considering this is a fairly blocky looking port too. A likely unpopular opinion for Commodore 64 fans, but I really do think that the MSX conversion just played that little better, dare I say it. Yes, we have a black floor, but is that really a bad thing? After all, we are navigating through dungeons here, and why should they really be all lit up like in most versions? I think that could be a good way of explaining this. Now, in terms of gameplay, it certainly plays well with fairly faster version 2 compared with the C64 port, although sprites are largely made up of one colour in this version. They kind of look nicer than the C64's, and they aren't particularly pixelated either. Regardless of having many baddies on screen at the same time, the MSX port seems to handle all this really well. Considering the fairly dull look with the Commodore 64 conversion, I actually thought the ZX Spectrum port looked and played a little faster with the specky, and seemed the case for the very similar looking MSX conversion too. I played this on my OLED screen and good lord did these Spectrum colours look good. I highly recommend OLED screens for Spectrum games. Firstly, there is much more activity with enemies with the Spectrum version, and as we know, the game is more awesome with larger swarms of baddies. It gives the player that sense of panic should you be running on low health, for example. Although there is no voice synth at all in the Spectrum's version, or no instructions as you play through it, I think the smoothness and very basic and almost berserk look about it makes up for those sacrifices. Unlike the C64's conversion, the Spectrum's version also doesn't look as pixelated and blocky. One lucky thing that developers didn't need to add for home computer versions of Gauntlet is music in game, just sound effects. And so this Amstrad CPC version could use that to its advantage by adding more to the game itself. I think that out of all of the three major 8-bit micros here in Britain, those being Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and of course this platform, the Amstrad, the CPC is superb conversion. Although it felt like monsters on screen at the same time, wasn't as hectic as the Spectrum's port, this significantly reduces the risk of frame rate slowdowns and flickers. The port for Amstrad is nice and colourful, sounds really well too, and plays truly nicely. A truly faithful 8-bit computer port of the original 1985 arcade game. The Sega Master's Gauntlet conversion is a very respectful port. It looks and plays the part, and it plays really well too, with some really nice colours, especially on the tiles themselves, or as some people like to call them, as sprites. Dungeons are nicely put together with added extras of making the floor look like a real floor rather than just painting a single colour like some other ports have done. The only issue with this 8-bit console version is the pace of it. After playing several different versions of this game at this point, I did notice there was an increased speed, which I guess is fine sometimes. You just need to get to exits and save some time. Other than that, like I say, a great port with some nicely implemented controls with nice collision detection too. The Atari ST port looks great, and it also plays very well too. The sound effects are pretty ample for imitating the source material. It scrolls very smoothly, and no issues from this version with massive frame drops like some other versions have had. The sprites are really nicely drawn, with a very nice use of colours for the dungeons and so on, but the next port in the video can push it that little much further. And in first place, I've actually ranked Gauntlet IV for the Sega Mega Drive. Gauntlet IV was its own game, but it also came packed with the original arcades game. Of course, enhancing it with some really fitting background music, as well as some impressive voice and sound effects too. The game depth looks much better than many other versions in this video. It kind of gives the player the illusion that we are fairly high up looking down into the dungeons. The clever shadow work on each sprite and even objects make this happen really nicely. The hordes of monsters can get overwhelming in this version, but that doesn't stop the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis from doing a great job with this very awesome conversion. It is very smooth to control with excellent collision detection, and the color palette use is really nicely done too with this port. And that's it for today's ranking of various different ports for Gauntlet. So let me know if you agree with my top place. Which version did you play growing up in? Which was the version you most hated? Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching. Today we are checking out the various ports of Rastan Saga, or just Rastan as it is more commonly known as. The arcade original by Taito, granted, hasn't gone down as a classic hack and slash title with better arcade games out there, but it's likely a game you had as a kid whether you liked it or not. Everybody seems to have their own stories of a particular version of this game. The game itself is of course set in a mystical fantasy world, very similar to something like Conan the Barbarian in theme. And of course the 1980s had its fair share of muscle men wanting a piece of success, where Arnold Schwarzenegger had it with Conan. Personally, I loved the Red Sonja as a kid, but that's another story. The Rastan ports were mainly published by Imagine for the computer side, and Sega published the console versions, which was both Master System and the Sega Game Gear. Now, let me just give you a heads up, there isn't going to be any homebrew versions, that's aftermarket versions, such as the Amiga version, which is going to be released at some point soon. We hope this is going to be looking at every original port from back in the day, so here we go. Most of you who knows the different versions of Rastan very likely knew that this would be the worst of all versions, the godforsaken Commodore 64 version by Imagine. I had this game on its Hit Squad label, which my mum and dad bought with the C64 for Christmas 1990. It got played quite a lot over time, and just like the C64 port of Robocop, Rastan was a broken mess for more than just one reason. Watch Rastan's feet as I walk across the mountains. His feet doesn't even touch the floor, and every now and again a swarm of bats will attack you, leaving you no time at all to defend yourself. Enemies will walk across water whilst it gives you instant death. The cherry on the cake here is the infamous castle stage, where it is near impossible, if not totally impossible, to cross the ropes. It is unnecessarily difficult to play. Enemies will deplete your energy more than other versions will. Collision detection is very bad in this too. I later realised later in life how truly bad this version was when I seen how it was supposed to look in play. An absolute joke of a game, and Martin Galway, who composed the music, likely was ashamed to have his name stamped on this ridiculous nonsense. So where do I start with this little Amstrad CPC port, which likely caused so much anger with its utterly trashy gameplay? Well, I'll begin with climbing ropes. As you will see in the footage, Rastan doesn't have a sprite designed to climb. Instead, he kind of awkwardly jumps up. Just a very bizarre look. Now, for those who have never seen this version, you'll likely be more concerned about the ridiculously slow frame rate. Yes, damn, this port is slow, likely going at 1 FPS maximum. Now, in other versions, including the arcade game, we can bash a block to jump down into the first cape to grab a new weapon. Not here though, you can simply just drop down, saving Mr. Rastan some energy for battling more evildoers. You will also notice that weapons are concealed within boxes here rather than having a sprite that looks like the weapon. Collision detection is pretty good, and the blood splatter of enemies look pretty smart too, but dear lord, the slow pacing is unbearable with this game. I died around 3/4 of the way in after around 4 minutes of gameplay to end up back at the start. At that point I had enough and just turned it off. Would I recommend the Amstrad CPC conversion? I would rather recommend Ping Pong, as that game offered more entertainment value. Call me strange, but I have always been fond of the ZX Spectrum port. In fact, it is likely my favourite here, if I am honest with you. If you didn't grow up with a ZX Spectrum like I did, you can learn to appreciate it or just write it off as a British budget computer of the 1980s. Give it some time and you'll learn to appreciate it just like I did. Although colours are an issue here and can be sometimes hard to see enemies and projectiles when things like colour clash happen with backgrounds, this is surprisingly fun and fairly speedy game to play. It's got perfect collision detection and spot on controller functions, fine that work with the Kempton adapter. Of course, very rudimentary Spectrum sounds. Again, to me, I personally love these sounds. They absolutely reek in 1980s geekiness and I love it. Sadly, the tape image crashed at the end of stage 1, so I couldn't progress into the next part of the game, which was the castle. Is this the nicest looking Spectrum game ever? No, absolutely not, but still, give it a go. Like they say, graphics isn't everything, and that's why many of us are coming back to old school gaming again. The MSX2 title was actually named as Rastan Saga, as it was originally titled for the arcades. Now, although the game plays fairly nicely and it scrolls pretty well with no choppy frame drops, the strange thing with this conversion is being single screen rather than multi-scrolling screens. The backdrops are pretty nicely animated here too. The MSX sprites used are, as can be expected, one colour with background being exposed through their bodies, kind of similar to ZX Spectrum games. The layout for this MSX2 version is also slightly different. For example, as we travel through stage 1, we have ramps where Rastan can slide and then jump. Was this really necessary? Well, not really, but I think it adds a bit more diversity to the gameplay. Music is pretty good here too. I made it past the first boss inside of the castle and can say this is definitely a major step up from most versions of this game. I was majorly impressed with this 16-bit Apple II GS conversion. It looks great. I was playing this through a keyboard and couldn't find a button which made Rastan jump, so could only get so far within the first stage. Regardless, as we can see with the limited footage I have here, this looks incredible. Only issue is with this conversion is that it suffered dramatically with its choppiness as I'm walking around. The backgrounds and sprites are pretty much top notch and the sound is pretty special too. At some point I will be revisiting this version again, but without a doubt one of the better ports, even though it looks strange when walking along. The Sega Master System conversion is very similar to the MSX2 port. Although this game is much more refined and includes full multi-scrolling, this game also had FM sound capabilities. Out of the 50-odd Sega Master System games which supported this, the FM sound unit was mainly sold in Japan, but made games sound a little better. You can certainly hear the difference with Rastan compared with its default original sound. This game is one I had as a kid on my Sega Master System. It's a decent 8-bit console port for what it is attempting to copy, and Sega did a fairly good job of it too. It is slightly different from the arcades game, but in terms of Rastan, this was a sacrifice, and it's not like Rastan has the best bunch of home conversion ports anyways. So finally I found a version of Rastan, or rather a conversion of Rastan, that actually seemed like it cared to look like the arcade game. This is the IBM PC compatible DOS version, and this is a significantly better game than everything else here that I've covered. It copies the game to the T, and the music and sound effects also sounds really good too, and very convincing to the arcade classic game. Great sprite collision detection and a fairly challenging difficulty level with this version too. The graphics are really nicely animated, and it's just overall a very good, decent port worth playing. So if you fancy playing a port and fancy playing the best port, which is dedicated to being just like the arcade game, the DOS version without a doubt is the best one to go for here by the seams of things. So that's it for today's short video on comparing the different ports of Rastan. So you have seen some absolutely trashy, really shameful games here, but we finally got there and nailed it. That DOS does appear to be a really good version of it. So anyways, let me hear your stories. I'm sure you got some to tell in the comments section. Which version was you lumbered with growing up? Did you have the atrocious Commodore 64 version just like I did? So anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.
The time bomb is set.
Now, to be honest, I knew about Alien Syndrome throughout my gaming life, around 30 years or so, but I never really bothered playing the 1987 Sega game of Alien Syndrome until a few years back, really. It is, I suppose, a knockoff to some extent of the film Aliens. Kill aliens on board ships, rescue hostages, or as they are known in the game as comrades. From here, take on bosses. It's a superb top-down multi-scrolling run-and gun game that did very well in the arcades at the time, and as always, these big games had a multitude of conversions wherever you wanted it or not. The arcade game ran on Sega System 16 hardware. Now, compared with other arcade port videos I've done so far, this one was a little bit more sporadic in placing versions of the game. The reasoning will hopefully become evident as you watch through. There is versions that you might also expect to be higher up, but like I say, this one wasn't particularly easy to judge. Either the version looked good but played bad, or the version didn't look so good but played well. We even have a portable version here, which was slightly different but was also very good. So yes, a particularly difficult game to rank, but as always, if I missed out a particular port, I sincerely apologise. But anyways, here we go. first thing that struck me with this Amstrad CPC conversion was obviously the size of the gameplay area. That sometimes isn't an issue for some games, but then it comes to everything else which is wrong with the Amstrad's 1988 ACE conversion. Firstly then, of the nice touches of destroying aliens and worms in the game is that little explosion effect that happens when shooting them down. No effect at all with CPC's port. They will literally just disappear, almost like they've been sucked into the vacuum of space. Secondly, the alien worms reminded me of the crisp Whatsits. Thirdly, the very bad scrolling is difficult to judge when moving in any direction. This is something we'll see more of in this video's various ports. This version isn't very nice to control either. It does suffer from frame drops, and finally, the colours used are really bad. Remember the What's-It analogy I just made? Well, the worms are even coloured orange, as so are other things. A very odd choice of colours used in the CPC version here. The MSX conversion is, well, to be honest, terrible. Slightly better than the What's-It eating creatures that plagues the ship in the Amstrad version, but literally by a fraction really. Yes, it is pretty much monochrome, which isn't a big deal, especially for hardcore computer geeks like myself, but good grief, this game was just so slow to play. It looked bad too while scrolling the screens to navigate for my comrades. Just a really atrocious version here. Now, normally it's usually the Nintendo NES arcade conversions which are different from others. In this case, this is going to the Sega Master System. Firstly, as you'll see, this version doesn't multi-scroll at all. It is strictly a single screen game. The suspense is totally lost here, as we can see straight off the bat where the aliens are as they generate. It just doesn't really take away that suspense. It's a very dull conversion which takes anything great about it away. There doesn't even seem to be maps either to identify where your comrades are being held. By pressing a button, we can access how many comrades are remaining in the game. Yeah, it's a bleak game, and it seems strange to put a Master System game so low down in this list, but for finding the version of Alien Syndrome which matches to the next best thing in the arcade game, this has far too many problems, and I haven't even mentioned how brightly coloured this space vessel even is. Despite the lack of colours, the game plays so much better than the poor Amstrad CPC version. This Spectrum conversion, although not perfect by any means in controlling either Ricky or Mary, seems a little strange. In fact, almost weirdly comparable, or at least reminded me of the odd controls in James Bond's License to Kill game. The game is a huge step up from the Amstrad's version, where moving around the vessel you're on. There just seems to be a little more time and more of the gameplay screen is revealed in this version, which gives you more time to prepare for incoming enemies. The characters look pretty cool in this too, and by the seams of things, even all of the different weapons are here too, just like the arcade version. The boss in this version is, however, very difficult compared with other ports. Despite this 1989 Mindscape IBM PC compatible DOS version looking good and to some degree sounds okay for a DOS game of this era, the game suffers with very poor frame rates. This is very annoying when attempting to make it around the vessel with a timer, not knowing if there is aliens right next to you when you move in any direction to see more of the map. This isn't the only version to have this atrocious issue which maximises difficult level without need. The game itself is nicely coloured, and it even does have some primitive sounding speech synth, which does add to the overall arcade experience. The game does experience frame drops, especially on the first boss. I will note here that sprite design are actually some of the best out of all the versions of this game. almost an enhancement over how it originally looked. Overly, not completely awful version, but by far not the best. Although the Commodore 64's conversion by Ace, which released back in 1988, looks fairly decent, sounds decent, it even controls really well too, the really annoying thing with this port is that it streams slow scrolling, and because we are also on a timer to rescue comrades, this makes things incredibly difficult when walking in any direction near the borders to navigate around. It just doesn't move quick enough. Aliens will pretty much appear and give you a split second to destroy them. You will lose plenty of lives with this alone. Like I said, everything else in this Ace conversion is very nicely put together really. The music isn't the same as the 1987 arcade's original, but it kind of works well and also adds sound effects too. We also get no speech synth, but that seems to be a general thing with every port of this game. But we do get a synopsis of the mission, which adds to that authentic feel. It really is a shame about the slowness of scrolling, otherwise the C64 port could have been a highly regarded classic. To be honest, although this version on the Sega Game Gear doesn't strictly follow the arcade game in terms of mapping, it just seemed too good to dismiss it as the terrible Sega Master System version. Now, firstly, we can destroy doors in this port rather than just walking in and out and waiting for them to shut behind us. The music is really atmospheric too with this port. The only reason that I didn't want to put this one any higher is because we are actually searching for arcade perfection. It does make me chuckle though how the Game Gear is much superior than the actual console version by Sega. Virtually the same as the next computer version in this list, although this Atari ST port lags pretty badly in places. It does look the part though, granted, but by far the next version on the next platform is much better. Now, what can I say about the Commodore Amiga's 1988 port by Ace? Well, yep, it looks really faithful to the arcade version without a doubt. It's not overly high in bright contrasty colours, weapons are great to use, killing aliens is very nice too with their dying animations. Nothing wrong here at all really apart from that damn scrolling. Again, although not as bad as some of the other parts so far, the Commodore Amiga version still thinks that having a more fluid screen that moves quicker and exposing more of the maps isn't a big deal for this game. It really is, and it totally ruins the gameplay like most other versions. Something else with the Amiga port is the occasional frame drops. Not as bad as the Atari ST, but just such a shame, just like the Commodore 64 conversion could have done so much better. And finally, we have made it to a conversion that has no problems with multi-scrolling around the gameplay area without so much slowness involved, which many of the other versions had. This is the 1988 Sanritsu Famicom conversion, or Nintendo Entertainment System conversion. Now, at this point of recording, I actually felt this port was very easy compared with others. I'm not sure if the game itself is just simply an easy game on the NES, or that this game played just as well as the 1987 Sega arcade game. Noticeably, the music is very Nintendo 8-bit, but does a really good version of that slowing, dreary, dreaded music for the stages like the arcade original did. This version also appears to give the player much more time too, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. This version also requires you to collect every single hostage, otherwise you cannot progress to the boss segment of the game. It's a really nice conversion and controls nicely with some good work around sprite collision. And in first place we have the inevitable Sharp X68000 1992 by Dempa Shabuncha release. This truly offers the full arcade experience and, dare I say it, actually plays a little better than the original 1987 game itself. Some slight changes here, where the first boss, for example, is very different from the arcade game, but damn, this really is the port to go for. Smooth scrolling, no problems there, unlike 80% of the different versions which failed to do something about this issue. Superb collision detection, nice colours which are on par with the arcade game. Yes, Sharp X68000 users would have absolutely rejoiced with its conversion, without a doubt. This really is an amazing version of our beloved Alien Syndrome game. And that's it for today's ranking the port. So like I said from the get-go in this video, it was a very strange list to compile and how to rank some of these. But anyways, let us know in the comment section, as always, which version you grew up with, and do you agree with the list I've compiled? And bear in mind, like I say, this wasn't particularly easy to do. But anyways, until next video, thanks for watching. Today we are taking a look at the various ports of Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation. Many of you have requested this one shortly after I uploaded the original Chase HQ video a little while back. If you don't know of this game, it is sometimes referred to as simply SCI. This is a 1989 Taito release, and of course it is the direct sequel to the 1988 original game. The premise is pretty simple: travel at high speed using boosts and catch up with criminals attempting to evade you. A really great arcade classic based on the Taito System Z hardware. Don't freak out when I mention that Ocean published some of these, a couple ain't that bad at all. The Mega Drive or Sega Genesis Chase HQ 2 will not be added here, as that game is a different game altogether. Remember, we are looking at Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation, not just Chase HQ 2. There was also Amstrad GX4000 port written but never officially released. Sega Saturns won't be included either, as this was a direct emulated arcade port for that system. So anyways, let's go catch some criminals. Have you seen my video for Chase HQ? The original Spectrum port was pretty damn good. Then we have this sequel on the ZX Spectrum. The arcade game opened up with 80s style red racing car, Nissan specifically, which then opens up to radio communications. We bypass that cool introduction here and go straight in for the radio part. Now bear in mind, I am playing the upgraded 128K version of this game, and this is how it is running. This 1990 release by Ocean is pretty bad considering the predecessor released around a year prior to this version. What is wrong with SCI then? Well, firstly, the crosshair is fairly difficult to see, as most of the time it's been obscured by other usage of the colour black, and so the crosshair kind of merges with other things going on at the same time. Secondly, this is very choppy. I have known smoother LCD games, if I'm honest with you. The cool parts where the helicopter flies in, well, that's not in this version by the seams of it, or I could be wrong. The music, whilst not being overshadowed by the sound effects, isn't too bad. It really isn't as good as Chase HQ was on the Spectrum a year prior to this release. The ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 ports are odds with Chase HQ and this sequel. The C64 port of the original game easily goes down as one of the slowest, most awful racing games on the Commodore 64, easily. If you haven't watched the video, it is pinned. So is this C64 version really that great? Well, yes it is, and of course this sequel is light years ahead of the original C64 game. We have a speedy and almost console quality game here. What made this even better was that Ocean put this directly onto cartridge. The music is some awesome sounding stuff, as well as its simultaneous use of sound effects too. It's a really nice 8-bit conversion and likely one of the best racers on the C64. This port even contains that helicopter too. Call me weird, but something about fast moving cars and helicopters just goes so well with action style films and games. It is tastic, man. The only issue I have with this 1990 release is we have no crosshair in this version at all, and I suppose if you weren't familiar with the arcade game, you might not have known to shoot at certain things. This version controls really nicely too, a good solid 8-bit port with a really nice use of colours and sprite design. The Atari ST conversion is a great looking game, but just like the next version for the next platform, this one suffers with frame rate issues. It really is a shame that 16-bit computer conversions had such a bad deal with this game. The Commodore Amiga Ocean conversion looks nice and very faithful to the arcade game too, just like the previous Atari ST version. The one thing that Ocean did wrong with this port was mess up the speed of it. Of course, this game for the Amiga is very choppy. I am not saying it's not playable by any means, just like the Atari ST version, but frame rates could have been adjusted a slight. We look at other Amiga racing games such as Jaguar XJ220, and it is clear that smoothness and racing titles could be achieved with the Amiga, but after all, this is Ocean. And of course, they released a fair amount of half-finished games in their Manchester headquarters back in the day. This version is so faithful that it even includes the motorbike surrounding the enemy vehicle at the end of stage 1. And not every port actually did this. It still makes me laugh how kids today think they have it so bad if a piece of texture hasn't rendered correctly. End of the world! They simply don't get it. To add more to this, it even included a massive arrow for the end boss. Such a real shame about this version, but we can thank Ocean for this, of course.
Stop talking nonsense. I know nothing. It's Bob the boss. She isn't.
Although in my opinion, the game actually looked better on the C64, the Sega Master System version just seemed much nicer to control. Again, sadly, no crosshair, so players are left in the dark with this conversion by Sega, released back in 1992. So a fairly late release for the Sega Master System console in its lifespan. It isn't necessarily an amazing conversion of the game, but seems pretty impressive as far as the Sega Master System is concerned. It doesn't struggle with frame rates, and like I say, it is very responsive to controls, and taking corners isn't as awkward as the C64 version was. This version opens with the car speeding off and includes that awesome helicopter dropping you a rocket launcher to take down the enemy attempting to evade you. I also found this version much easier to destroy the ending boss too on the stage 1, where it didn't seem like 5 minutes destroying it and chasing it. This Japanese 1991 release, direct from Taito for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, is a near perfect arcade experience as far as home consoles are concerned, that is. The game opens up pretty much with the car speeding off after hitting a button and continues with the radio communication segment. Silky smooth to play with weather changes too as you progress through the game, which I wasn't actually expecting. There is a cutback on some roadside objects such as buildings, and it is or appears to be missing the helicopter. At this point, I am sure you're thinking I'm some sort of helicopter nut. I am not a helicopter nut. I am merely making observations here to give us all a good analysis of this game. The game scrolls silky smooth with some seriously faithful music and sound effects to the source material. This is one amazing version and one of the better games on the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, and it gives the player a nice clear arrow which driver you need to shoot down. A seriously great conversion here, and it also makes you feel like you're actually travelling really fast. And that's it for today's SCI ranking the ports. So let me know what you thought of my choices in this video. What would you have placed at number 1? And what version did you have? Did you have that shockingly bad ZX Spectrum version? So let us know in the comments, and as always, if there's a ports video you want me to upload and look into, just drop a line in the comments. But thanks for watching.